Papers, papers. You're with us today to talk Judith Butler, top of the hour. Wow, it is actually exactly top of the hour.
Oh, yes.
Wow.
Great. I'm afraid there is no news.
No news at all. Well, there is news. Dan and I discussed the only important news of this week, which is that Hunter Biden was pardoned before we started recording. So sorry, listeners, you won't get our analysis of that incredibly important news story.
Oh, right, yeah. Or you mean the speculation ahead of time? Will he? Won't he?
Will he? All I said about Hunter Biden being pardoned was that, yeah, I said this to you. It sucks because I can't pardon my kid. And also the whole thing about it being crack is a bit shitty on account of it being Biden. But also, if I was Biden, I'd do the same thing. If I could pardon my son for smoking crack, I would pardon my son for smoking crack. So, you know what? That's my hot take. What are you going to do?
Mm-hmm. You're going to be a great dad, Jack.
All is forgiven, son.
Yes.
Well, Dan, this week we are continuing. You know what? Actually, before we get into this, let's just say we're kind of semi-banking a few episodes. So if we sound less prepared than usual, if I sound less prepared than usual.
I don't think that's possible for me to be less prepared than I usually am.
I told you were like, do you still want to record tonight? And I was like, I'm frantically Googling Judith Butler.
Google's Judith Butler. Yeah.
Google's Judith Butler once.
That's the alternate name for our podcast, I think.
Yeah, it was the first 2 years Google Murray Bookchin. Now it's Google Judith Butler. We're continuing our escapades of only reading essays from the odd numbered Endnotes, which we're doing now in Endnotes 3.
Yes, but it's impossible to get hold of Endnotes 2. This is the problem.
Exactly. And Endnotes 4 which one's the one with the picture on the front as opposed to the color? Might be Endnotes 4. I'm not sure.
Like,
do you have all of them?
No.
Okay.
I have a copy of 3, but I don't actually have it in my possession currently.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
So, I just did the same thing and read the PDF from LibCom.
Fair enough. Fair enough. We also found that at a charity shop, which I'm like, what is the story behind that? I'd love to know that.
Yeah, how did it end up there? I went to the guy in the back of the room and be like, do you have any more of this? It's like, no, what are you like? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that was either
excited for me, but he didn't care.
Oh, exactly. That was either someone doing the reverse turn of reading this and then becoming a Leninist and being like, I don't need this leftcom shit anymore, or somebody's like parent cleaning out their kid's room after they like went to college or something, and they were like, they don't need this shit. Maybe it was like Leninist parent being like, get this shit out of my house.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the one like charity bookshop in Canterbury where they just like hide all the marks at the bottom shelf. Clearly not embarrassed. Like I bought a Marx reader once from there, and they were like, "Shame it was all proven wrong, wasn't it?"
It's a shame. You're like, yes, but not for the reasons you think.
Yes.
You're like, I'm buying Endnotes here.
That's my nuanced leftist answer to everything.
Yeah. Well, if they said that when you were buying Endnotes, you'd be like, a fellow communizer. I see. Yes, interesting. The suppositions of Marx that have been proven wrong. I see. Well, what are you going to do? Well, this is the black Endnotes. It's got a very dark cover.
It's blue, I think.
Is it?
Well,
well, I might be colorblind. It looks black to me. Or yours was just left sitting in the sun for a long time.
Might have been in the sun for too long. Yeah.
What was I going to say about this? I always love reading Endnotes. No, there was nothing going on.
Jack was doing the judge a book by its cover section, and I just completely blundered all over it.
The formatting, it's quite good. This is also us being like, after we recorded last episode, we were like, oh fuck, we haven't thought of anything to read for the next episode. What are we going to do? And we went through a series of like 10 things that we were like, maybe we read this, and we were just sending links back and forth to each other. And we both got really tired, and we were like, just find something in Endnotes. Just read something in Endnotes. So that's one of these episodes for the listeners. Yes. One of those episodes.
Mm-hmm.
But
just be thankful it's not Murray Bookchin. Or be mad, one or the other.
Maybe next week. A
week.
Christmas Murray Bookchin episode.
Let's do that.
This was well, okay, I won't bury the lead anymore. We read The Logic of Gender by unnamed authors in Endnotes 3.
Great, love that.
And I read a lot of it today. Because of the truncated amount of time I had to read this. And I found it really challenging, but I don't necessarily mean that in like a bad way. It was just like I really liked this, really appreciated it. It's an excellent essay. But a lot of the like sentences in here are kind of reminiscent of the Joshua Clover, the kind of like, just endnotes, generally communization style of writing that is kind of like a bit French, as we've taken to saying here on the podcast, which again isn't necessarily like a haha, it's a bit French. It's like, coming up with names for things that are like not necessarily new concepts, but using new names for them, ideas of like that are kind of a bit like metaphorical ideas of spheres and, kind of like very flowery language. But having said all of that, that's my disclaimer for being like, I might struggle talking about this a little bit. Really phenomenal ideas in here. And despite Dan and I, maybe, I don't know, are we the best people to talk about this? Probably not. These ideas. I think all of these ideas are incredibly necessary if you want to like build an emancipatory project. So it's about time we got to some of them. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I had similar. Like, took a second reading to really like sort of pass out what was being said. There are some elements of this, although not like the reference to Judith Butler is like slight. And as I was saying before we started recording, it's basically just you're right, but for the wrong reasons kind of thing. So there isn't a sort of like a heavy postmodern strain in this in any way, shape, or form. But there were little elements of this that sort of like appeal to the bit of me that like loves a bit of Zizek or something, like just like a bit of sort of contrarian feeling philosophy. And so there's a degree of parsing out, like, are some of these analogies that are being made, like how strongly should they be weighted, or what have you, or I don't know. But it does have really quite a firm. Well, it has quite a concrete intention. It's got a sort of heavy dose of sort of Marxist value theory, political economy base to it. It also is quite like takes a particular sort of has a particular attitude toward history and the analysis of modes of production, which is reminiscent of the sort of broader Endnotes ecosphere, I guess, but which I know we can get into in a minute as well. I'm just like talking very vaguely now.
Hey, I think it's the writing is rubbing off on you.
It's
great.
Like, that's great. Yeah. Oh yeah.
It exists in an EndNote sphere, that's for sure. Yeah. It was funny because it wasn't until kind of like the end of this essay that I was like, that's why this was published in EndNotes. Oh, okay, I see. Because it kind of, like most essays and kind of, well, most Marxist essays, I guess, it kind of ends with a not quite like appeal to a political project, but like motions towards a political project. And that one is very reminiscent of one that you would find in communization theory. But for actually a really interesting reason, which again, we'll get to. So, yeah.
How should we describe the project of this essay, do you think? Like, one of the things when I was saying sort of the historical basis of this, one of the things that's quite appealing to me anyway is that like it's really searching for a specifically capitalist formula for what gender is. Like it doesn't fixate too heavily or explicitly denies that it has any interest in both a sort of like biological reading of what gender is, although there are some aspects of their argument which one might say, okay, you're talking about sort of biological facets of human beings and human bodies, but I think that's just a degree of materialist analysis that can't be avoided. But they are intending to avoid the discussion of biology, and they're also trying to avoid reaching back into deep history or even into like the political economy of feudalism, say, from which a sort of a particular formulation of sort of like gendered relations come, but they're very fixated on what are the specifically capitalist forms of gender relations, where do they emerge from. That's not to say that they aren't emergent from prior modes of production, but it's very much in the vein of like a line of argumentation which sees modes of production as unique and focuses on the differences between them rather than the continuity between them, I suppose.
Yeah, and you're definitely right, because I was kind of trying to think of like what is the research question of this essay, or like what is it trying to do, and it's definitely defending those kind of ideas that you hinted at the beginning about like ideas surrounding Judith Butler's theories of sex and gender, but really attempting to come to them from a like Marxist political economic approach, as opposed to one that might be more postmodern or something like that. Um, and it was really interesting because Judith Butler is somebody that I haven't necessarily like. You come across them a lot in Marxisty circles and in theoretical circles and stuff like that, but you don't necessarily like. At least I haven't necessarily like taken the dive into their work before. So it was interesting to really, but my point is that those ideas about the socialization of not just gender but also of sex is something that I've really found interesting for a long time. But because of my like you know Marxoid brain, I've always been kind of like, well, what is the actual like grounding and basis of this? And this essay does a really good job of kind of attempting to, dive into really, as you say, like situate ourselves within the society that we exist within, not try to transhistoricize ideas of gender, ideas of sex, really make a concrete analysis of the world that we exist within, and then eventually use that analysis of capitalism to kind of come to pretty much, I think, almost exactly the same conclusions as somebody like Judith Butler, which is, to not to just kind of get to the point, which is that obviously gender is something that is very historically specific and that changes over time, but that and is also specific to the society that it exists within. But if you take that analysis one step further, so is sex, right? So it's really really fascinating, and yeah, the authors really attempt to kind of like tie value theory into this in a way to really show the kind of like uh relationship, I suppose. We were trying to discuss before we started recording how this relationship exactly works, but like the relationship between the way in which the core contradiction of capitalism functions, that between use value and exchange value, and then also this kind of contradiction supposedly between all these different binaries, sex and gender, male, female, all of these different things. And they kind of wind up seeing that they function in very similar ways. And yeah, we'll get into it. It seems kind of complicated, and it kind of is. It took me a few readings to really figure out what was going on here.
Yeah, I think I quite like the whole essay sort of structured around like a degree of criticizing or sort of altering pieces of terminology that have been adopted by like feminist Marxists more broadly, or different like binary distinctions, and so the sort of they work through various of these binaries as they go through. I think it might be good. I mean, their starting place is like a discussion of the idea of social reproduction, social production, and social reproduction, and sort of like not criticize, but like show how feminist Marxists have taken Marx's writings and gone with them in a particular direction. So, like, Marx talks of the authors of this essay, anyway, say sort of describe Marx as talking about reproduction in quite like broad terms. They're not really Marx isn't really talking about like the reproduction of any particular commodity, but rather like when Marx says reproduction, he sort of talks about the reproduction of society as a totality. Whereas for Marxist feminists, they've really fixated on the idea of like reproduction and the question of reproduction fixating around the reproduction of labor power, which makes perfect sense, right? Because really what they're digging down into is this world of sort of like work described quite broadly as like or sort of degrees of work done privately in households or in families that is, it's in a lot of ways like separate from the sort of generally sort of the economic relations of capitalism more broadly, separate from the wage relation, but is work when it as constituted as labor done to reproduce labor power as a commodity. The reason why they're so sort of fixated on or why they can base their argument on the sort of very fundamentals of Marxist political economy is obviously that, like, for Marx, the nature of labor power as a commodity is entirely central to how capitalism functions, I suppose.
Yeah, and a Marxist kind of like feminist analysis of capitalism and like political orientation, right? Because one of the things that gets critiqued a lot in here is this like autonomism and also some of the kind of political conclusions of somebody like Silvia Federici, which was so funny when they talk about Silvia Federici, they kind of dunk on her. And then there's like this massive 2-page long footnote where it's like, but look, we really like Silvia Federici. She's really cool, but she's just wrong here, which I thought was really funny. But yeah, all of this comes from exactly like what you're saying, which is this analysis of, you know, the unusual commodity, which is the commodity of labor power, right? It's this thing that creates value. It's the commodity that workers have to turn themselves into. You know, this is the reason Marx started Capital with an analysis of the commodity, because workers are treated like commodities, right? And it's really interesting because they're really, again, attempting to really specifically ground us within the society that we exist within. And doing that kind of raises some uncomfortable truths about reproductive labor for them, because they're really just saying that what is the value of labor power? Well, Marx describes it as the value of all of the things that are required to reproduce a specific worker, all of those other commodities, right? So food, diapers, I guess, I don't know, gasoline for your car, a car, a house, different things like this. But their point is that crucially, the things that determine the value of labor power, it's all dead labor. And they're kind of just making the point where they're like, well, quite a bit more goes into social reproduction of workers than just this idea of a bunch of things falling off of a shop cart. You can't reproduce a worker with a tin of beans and a bunch of diapers that are in like a bag, right? It's like you need a bunch of other work that goes into that. And the kind of crucial point of this analysis is that that work that is necessary for social reproduction of workers is kind of like exterior to capitalism. Obviously, it's not actually exterior to capitalism. It's just that capitalism doesn't actually consider this to be socially useful labor. And it kind of doesn't treat it as labor as such. It's not socially validated. It's not value producing. And this is kind of where the authors would disagree with autonomous feminists, right? And a lot of Marxist feminists, because autonomous would basically say that anything that reproduces labor power produces value, right? And they're basically saying, well, that's not true because capitalism doesn't treat it like that. Capitalism doesn't treat housework necessarily as value producing, because it doesn't produce value. I mean, that's kind of a truism, what I just said. But basically, this kind of labor that goes into social reproduction is not considered labor by capitalism. And so any attempt to kind of build a political project around, you know, wages for housework, that kind of thing, they're kind of saying it's doomed to fail, more or less because capitalism doesn't consider this stuff work. It's work. There's a bunch of different concrete that work goes into it. They're not saying that there isn't. They're just saying that it exists within and here's our first, you know, buzzword of the day, a different sphere of labor and a different sphere of capitalism. One that is very reminiscent of kind of like the ecological ideas that we came across in Jason W. Moore, where Jason W. Moore would just call this stuff appropriation, right? Like capitalism doesn't give a shit about the quote unquote like work that went into making fossil fuels or growing trees that we use to build homes or something like that. It doesn't give a shit about that. Those are basically just free gifts that capitalism requires, but that it doesn't value the, again, quote unquote, labor that went into it. It's a similar analysis here. Capitalism doesn't consider social reproduction, certain elements of social reproduction, to actually be labor. It isn't socially validated labor. So again, if we want to have an analysis of the world as it actually exists, we can't just go, but it is labor. Of course it's labor. They're working. The society we exist within doesn't consider it labor, and so it doesn't treat it as such, right? Yeah.
that they had a weird, like, there was a difficult piece of terminology that took me a little while to work out, because they talk about social labor and then non-social social labor. Like,
yeah, there's
to
a lot of that kind of
try
stuff.
and get around this distinction, right? Like the labor that is being done in the workplace for a wage, which can be compared with other social labors done in other workplaces by virtue of the fact that they can both be they both are quantified, not directly, but they're both indirectly quantified in the form of socially necessary labor time. Like, there's that particular section of work done which makes it social in a Marxist sense. Like, it is recognized by capital, and there are metrics which capitalism uses, even if it's not necessarily aware of what it's doing. There are metrics it uses to compare these forms of labor. And then there are forms of labor which are social, non-social. Like, they're non-social in the sense that they fall outside of the forms of measurement recognized by capitalism, but to us, to the rest of us, they are the same kind of thing. They are the same kind of labor. And I mean, this argument that does like evolve into quite a familiar one, which is like, um it's possible for the same type of labor, or the same type of, I don't know what word we should use, the same type of work, the same type of social activity to be both social or non-social, depending on the, I'm going to say social again, depending
Sphere.
on the social relations that it is encapsulated in. If it's in, if you do childcare and you're paid a wage, and that wage is then used to reproduce your own existence as a worker, then it's social labor, I suppose.
Yeah, it's
But then
labor.
also,
Capitalism considers it as such.
yes, yeah. But if that childcare is done by a parent in the home, unwaged, then it sort of falls into this other category outside of this a sphere recognized by capital as socially useful, valuable labor, I suppose.
Socially concrete, valuable.
Concrete,
I've struggled with concrete and abstract. They're throwing in
yeah.
like non-social labor, social non. It's like I'll read a little paragraph of that, because that point that you just made about some work being, the same concrete work being having a different character depending on what sphere that it's in, I think is one that's really vital to their whole analysis. So they say any labor necessary to turn this raw material, this basket of goods, into the commodity labor power is therefore not considered living labor by Marx, and indeed, in the capitalist mode of production, it is not deemed necessary labor at all. This means that however necessary these activities are for the production and reproduction of labor power, they are structurally made non-labor. This is necessary labor. This necessary labor is not considered as such by Marx, because the activity of turning the raw materials equivalent to the wage into labor power takes place in a separate sphere from the production and circulation of values. These necessary non-labor activities do not produce value, not because of their concrete characteristics, but rather because they take place in a sphere of the capitalist mode of production, which is not directly mediated by the form of value. And so it basically is something like the systems analysis that Jason W. Moore has, again, because they're not saying this isn't work, this isn't capitalist work at all. They're saying that when you think about the reproduction of a system, it's not like you have normal labor and then you have reproduction. They're saying you have to look at this as like an, emergent totality that is constantly ongoing. It's constantly reproducing itself, right? And so they're, basically trying to say that capitalism appropriates, but capitalism also, like, it has these two different spheres, one that follows the laws of capitalism that we all know and love, and the other one that doesn't. But that isn't to say that it's not necessary for capitalism. I mean, obviously, like, I feel like a dog with a microphone could tell you that. Like, obviously, all of these things are still necessary, and it just goes to show that it's like, you know, obviously capitalism is not a viable system. Like, I don't mean like viable system like Stafford Beer. I mean like, lowercase v, lowercase s. Like, it just isn't viable because, you know, judging itself based off of its own rules, it can't survive because it requires all of these different, what Jason W. Moore called free gifts, right? It requires something like fossil fuel. It requires, appropriated labor, and it requires all of these different spheres, as the authors would say here. And the interesting thing to me that I was thinking about while I was reading this was like the way in which all of these kind of like appropriated spheres of work and of nature and ecology and all of that stuff seem to kind of be more or less collapsing at a relatively similar point. I mean, surely there's something there. Surely, there's a reason for that. But it's like, we'll get into the question of, Judith Butler's ideas of like the troubling of gender and kind of capitalism's, own, like how it's basically tearing these necessary ideas in capitalisms of like gendered labor and of gender and sex, on their own, just as such, tearing them apart, even though it needs them. And at the same time, it's like, look around the world. It's like the contradictions are all falling apart. And obviously, the connections between something like a Marxist feminist analysis or the analysis here and ecology, they're pretty obvious. But it's just odd in which the way it's all kind of converging. I think I brought this up on an episode recently, but in a slightly different context. But yeah, it's just odd. It's like, there's something to that, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a really good description. And one of the things that's also brought out in this is sort of between the lines, but I guess this is presented as well, it's not presented thus, but it could be read as like quite a good description of a fundamental contradiction within capitalism, right? That like, that there is this artificial division made within the world of human activity, whereas some of it is defined in one way and some of it is defined in another. And if human beings want to sort of like collectively take charge of their collective activity, I suppose, like make themselves one organism under socialism, perhaps it's a particular way of framing it, but like as socialists, we do want to bring everything into being one body of social work that can be consciously organized and directed and understood. And this is one of the divisions which gets in the way of that, I suppose. It's that like distinction, I guess.
We need to figure out the Borg's views of gender. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, well,
that's what I'm getting. Socialism is
I was watching the new Picard's, not new, but like Picard, and the Borg are featured in that a little bit. And this is very off tangent. They make the Borg collective look quite compelling in some ways. Like, they do a bit. That series, despite some of its flaws, does a better job of like making the Borg make sense in a lot of ways. It's like,
what was Picard's Borg name when he was a Borg in Next Generation?
Locutus.
Locutus, that's it. Well done. Yeah. Locutus. I always loved that.
Anyway,
now we're just
Star Trek tangent in a little while.
Yeah, wow, that's true. Locutus. Trivia of the day. Brought to you by Auxiliary Statements. So another thing,
I might be pro Borg, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, going back to the authoritarian personality types.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm more of a Ferengi kind of guy, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Say live and let live.
Yeah, live and let live. And also, it's a horrific stereotype that maybe shouldn't have been in that show.
Yeah,
anyway. Going off of what you just said, I was really... This isn't necessarily something they get into. They bring up in this how there are these two different spheres, right? The spheres we've kind of been talking about, and they call them DMM and IMM spheres. And it's directly market-mediated spheres and indirectly market-moderated spheres, to basically get into this distinction of, the different economic spheres that exist within capitalism and how different types of concrete or the exact same types of concrete labor can exist within these two different spheres, kind of like what you were saying. And they use this as kind of like, one of the key terminology things of their analysis here. And they make the point that the IMM sphere can't really ever be fully like subsumed into capitalism. And they kind of draw a little bit on Moishe Postone's analysis of like time, right? Which we came across a little bit of in Fossil Capital when we read that, which is basically like, a factory line, you can always decrease the socially necessary labor time for making a can of beans because you just automate it, figure out labor saving strategies. The example they use in the IMM sphere is that like you can't decrease the socially necessary labor time for looking after a kid, which I thought was kind of funny because they're like, a kid needs to be looked after for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can't like decrease that through labor saving devices, right? And again, this gets into Moishe Stone's ideas of like abstract time, and it made me think about fossil capital because I was like, if you apply this to ecology, there are some ways in which capitalism has been able to do something similar to like capitalize. This is I don't really know how to explain this, but like in terms of ecology, capitalism has kind of been able to infringe on a similar sphere within ecology. Because like when we talk about fossil capital, there was this barrier that the early textile industry in Britain came up against, which was namely trying to use renewable energy, which they had been using to power their mills forever, right? Wind power, water power wasn't necessarily jiving with the capitalist mode of production because it needed to abstract away from these geological differences in space. It needed to abstract away from waiting for the wind to blow or waiting for the water to flow a lot heavier. And so through the kind of adoption of fossil fuels, it actually was able to fully capitalize like the relations of this specific, industry where you would have thought, oh, you actually can't abstract away from this. I'm kind of trying to make a comparison between the commons, or no, not the commons, the flow, I think is what Andreas Malm calls it, the flow of like renewable energy sources, and the kind of IMM sphere here. I sound like such an asshole, but like the idea I think is interesting because it's like, I think maybe if you look at a broader analysis of this stuff and you kind of try and make these tenuous connections that I'm making between like reproductive labor and ecology, like there isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule for some of these things because on a case by case basis, capitalism actually has been able to kind of like abstract away from space and time in ways that you wouldn't necessarily assume that it could have in the past, if that makes any sense.
No, it's really good. And it's you remember so much more of that book than I do.
It's because I saw Andreas Malm at the conference and I was like, recall everything.
Why do I disagree with this? Okay. But also, one of the things that does trigger in my mind is like something that I've just been trying to pass and think about is, obviously there is like a slippage between the two, right? I was just saying that like it's possible for different types of work, like real world concrete labor, to fall into both of these spheres under different circumstances. As you say, there is this. Well, there are things which capitalism wants to do to human labor to make it sort of like quantifiable and fit within its metrics and sphere of understanding and ability to exploit and extract value from, and there, as you say, like it has to have a certain temporal character and it has to be disciplinable and has to be able to be quantified in socially necessary labor time. And so there's an extent to which exactly what you were saying, there's this like the directly market mediated sphere in some ways might want to encroach into the indirectly market mediated. It's trying to capture some of this labor, and later on in this essay they do talk about the scenario of like having you obviously you can't reduce the amount of time that a child needs to be cared for, but you can increase the number of children that one adult cares for, so you can sort of like bring childcare in that way into the directly market mediated sphere by just paying somebody to look after 5 or 10 or however many children they can physically cope with, although there is a limit there as well. But then also there's a contradiction there in my mind anyway between that and then this idea that there is this sphere outside of capitalism that sort of needs to exist for it to provide free inputs. That's the Jason W. Moore version of the narrative, where it's like there always needs to be a necessary outside. Maybe there isn't a contradiction there, and it's just capitalism is always looking for ways to encroach into the sort of the indirectly market mediated sphere. But then this essay does end with a description of state austerity and the sort of withdrawing of care. Although I suppose that's not that. Okay, so an extra layer to add on to this distinction, directly market mediated and indirectly market mediated, is to say that you can do wage labor that's indirectly market mediated, right? In the form of the state can decide to provide resources from general taxation, which is taken, it's like a portion of the labor which capitalism has recognized as being valuable. They've sort of taken that portion of social labor and decided to allocate it to particular ends. And one of those ends it could be put to is providing certain of these social roles, whether it's childcare or cleaning or education or whatever. Like the state spends money, it pays people to do indirectly market mediated work, I suppose. So that's a big tangent. But when I say that the state withdraws aid, it's not capitalism withdrawing aid. It's like it's not a retreat of capitalism out of spheres of the indirectly market mediated that it's captured, but rather the state withdrawing from certain functions that it was providing, presumably to stabilize capitalism when it could or needed to. I don't know whether you have anything to say to that.
No, definitely, because I think all of that just raises the idea of, like how much of a closed system is capitalism actually, right? Because a Marxist analysis will always, well, maybe it actually won't, and especially not in volume 1, but you come away from thinking about capitalism in a Marxist analysis as this thing where it's like all it gives a shit about is socially necessary labor time, all it cares about is value production. That's it. If it ain't producing value, it don't make sense. Like, but reality, I mean, an analysis like this, an analysis of ecology seems to show that it is not as much of a closed system as we actually think it is. And I'd be interested to know what you think about this. It's like, could one imagine a world where capitalism, through coercion, is able to exist like with an entirely clean energy grid, with an entirely renewable energy production, with with a kind of like closing off of all of these different free gifts? To me, it would seem like history, if we're using history as a guide, it seems like all signs point towards absolutely not, right? But as a thought experiment, I guess you could imagine a world where capitalism is able to completely wean itself off of these free gifts. But then I guess you get into this analysis of social reproduction, and it's like, yeah, I don't know. It just seems like capitalism actually just isn't a closed system at all. And maybe that's one of the main contradictions, I guess. It might be obvious to some people, but I don't know.
Well, I guess it depends what your hard limit for capitalism is. Like, if you take a tendential fall in the rate of profit analysis, then I guess from my understanding of that, there is an argument that can be made to make a capitalism a closed system, I think. And the only limit is capitalism not having the ability to endlessly find more. It's constantly undermining the thing that gives what it produces value. It's constantly reducing through automation the amount of labor time that's included in a commodity. That's it sort of failing on its own terms, if that makes sense. It's not failing because it's found some kind of external, there isn't some hard limit that's an externality. They've not necessarily run out of some natural resource or some new continent or whatever. But
that makes sense. Yeah. Failing on its own.
But then you're just into different. That's just different versions of. I don't know.
Well, it's not a stable system. We can we can say that. Yeah, it's interesting. I think just because capitalism in the web of life really paints this picture of no, it absolutely needs these free gifts.
But I guess those limits can exist at the same time, and it's just which one becomes terminal. Your question is still valid. And I guess my response to be, okay, if capitalism did find a way to exist in a sort of closed system where it didn't have external inputs of the sort of Jason W. Moore sort, then the tendential fall in the rate of profit might be your ultimate hard barrier. I don't know. Sorry, I interrupted you.
When we reach 100% automation.
Yes.
Which will happen. And then it's the general cartel. And it's easy. Let's hope that happens soon.
Then we just press the socialism button, you know?
Yeah, baby. Yeah. Press the socialism button. Bezos will do that, hopefully.
Yeah. Or Xi Jinping, one or the other.
Yes, true. Choose your fighter. So there are a few more ideas in here before it kind of gets to the ultimate argument about gender as like a clearly obvious constraint now, which we'll get to. I think maybe we kind of touch on this idea of like bourgeois equality and what that's meant to kind of like reproducing.
My next page of notes.
Yes. Okay. Where it's synced up. Good. What this idea of like bourgeois right and bourgeois equality means to the kind of reproduction of gender as a like socially specific idea, the gender spheres, right? And this is an idea that we've come across loads, right? And it's basically that equal right under bourgeois law is basically just the right to be dispossessed and exploited, right? Because it's like, hey, there are no hereditary barriers to class anymore. You can just, anybody can be the next Oprah, anybody can be the next Bezos, anybody can be the next Musk, right? But obviously what comes along with that freedom in bourgeois society is the fact that you're completely dispossessed of everything except for your ability to sell your own labor power, and it also reproduces classes in kind of like a very contradictory, very funny way. And they apply this idea to the authors. I mean, apply this idea to the idea of like the quote unquote like sex blind labor market, right? Which is that, hey, capitalism doesn't care who you are, right? In theory, capitalism doesn't give a shit who you are, where you come from. All it cares about is the fact that you are willing to sell your labor power. And that's how it's supposed to work in theory. But because of the kind of like gendered reproduction, the reproduction of this idea of gender as women, as defined as, there's a long thing in here about how women are actually defined in capitalism, about, the ones who are able to have babies, right? Because of that, this comes along with a kind of very similar kind of like lack of freedom through bourgeois freedom, if that makes sense. And it's basically the idea that these gendered spheres of capitalism are recreated by defining women who are those people who are able to have babies. And because of that, they're kind of structurally kneecapped and handicapped at the point of selling their labor power, because eventually those women are forced into taking time off to have kids, to raise kids, to do all of these different things. And thus, through that act, it kind of cheapens women's labor power. And this, is presented to us as the wage disparity, right? Where in almost all spheres, women make on aggregate quite a bit less than men. And this is due to this kind of like, hey, everybody's treated the same. The labor market doesn't care who you are. It's sex blind. It doesn't actually care. But actually that kind of bourgeois right actually reproduces this gendered sphere, which actually handicaps women at the point of selling their labor power, and thus kind of, and here's our first mention of this word, dialectically reproduces gender and sex, and also the very disparities that are created through bourgeois right. Hopefully that was explained.
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel that they make between the formal equality of human beings who exist under a capitalist system where they all ostensibly engage with one another like purely as commodity owners. It just so happens that some people don't have any means of production commodities. All they have is their ability to work, and therefore you get these class relations which are fundamental to capitalism, but they're sort of covered by this sense of there being a sort of like civil equality between human beings. And what they're saying is a very similar thing happens, what you've just described, right? That like for that group of people who are sort of like recognized as being ones who are able to have and bear and raise bear children, at least, there is a sort of unfreedom that is that exists underneath the sort of a formal appearance of equality, I suppose. I do quite enjoy it. I guess it's a little bit of backtracking, but this is the point where this essay sort of like goes back toward being historical in some respects, or like um, decides to, or takes another tack, or expresses another version of describing capitalism in its historical specificity, I suppose. And they describe this process of, in pre-capitalist times and when capitalism was just emerging, the sort of like sphere of the private and the sphere of the economic was sort of like entirely localized within the family in some respects. Like they were sort of like home. They were like the economic sphere was just how you run a household kind of thing, or I guess how you run a petty farm or something in the feudalism, or whatever. And one of the things that they identify as being analogous, or a feature of the capitalist mode of production, is this sort of massive expansion of the sphere of the private. And then they ask themselves the question, well, like, what's the point of the continued existence of a public sphere, which they identify as like with politics and with civil society and with the state and what have you. And it's like, maybe that's sort of the dialectical move is saying that like we have to maintain that binary, that opposite, to be able to carry on with the sort of concrete working of capitalism. We have to maintain the formal idea of this sort of like civil society where everybody's equal, and purely so that we can actually do the work of exploiting people behind the scenes, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the only other thing is, I guess, to just get into kind of how this ties in with ideas of what sex and gender actually are, and to kind of get into a bit of the Judith Butler stuff, is they define it here. They say, we are now prepared to answer the gender question, which is one of my favorite beginnings to a section ever. What then is gender? For us, it is the anchoring of a certain group of individuals in a specific sphere of social activities. The result of this anchoring process is at the same time the continuous reproduction of two separate genders. And then they go on to kind of say, but the relationship between society and gender and sex is always in flux, and it's always changing, and the relationship between all of these things is always changing. What those things actually are always changing, and it's a very dialectical process of one thing influencing each other. And it's a lot, but basically the upshot of all of this is that Judith Butler's analysis, as far as I understand it, and if our listeners understand it a bit more, please do let us know, because this is obviously fairly important. Like, the upshot of Judith Butler's analysis is that, okay, a number of feminists in the past, radical feminists, have taken to questioning the idea of gender as historically specific, but they've left in place this naturalized view of what sex is. They've separated these two things, and they've gone, okay, gender is historically specific. It's specific to the society we exist within. It's specific to your neighborhood. It's specific to your country. It's specific to your generation. But sex, that is still a thing that's fairly naturalized. And Judith Butler would basically say, no, actually, you need to carry that same analysis of gender over to sex, because gender is obviously so specific to the society that you live within that it actually informs the like basis of sex as well. And for how I'm currently understanding this is that it's a very anti kind of like Platonic ideal of any of these things analysis that Judith Butler and the authors here are making, where it's like, all of these things are so wrapped up in the societies that we exist within, sex and gender, that you can never really get to the like bottom of, well, just what is the Platonic ideal of, the binary of sex and gender? What should these things actually be? Where the authors and Judith Butler just basically say, you can't do that. You're never going to be able to get to that point. So just don't bother. It's like, these things are completely determined by the societies they exist within. And this is, I think, a really difficult idea for loads of people, myself included. But it's one that I really find quite attractive, obviously. I mean, like, yeah, I don't know. It's funny. I was kind of trying to apply this to myself, and I was like, my whole life, I've never really been specifically I've never really specifically identified with any of the qualities that my specific cultural upbringing identifies with masculinity, but I've also not really been particularly entranced by that society's ideas of femininity either. And I think also I'm just like not comfortable enough with my own body to really begin questioning any of that stuff seriously. But it just kind of made me think where it's like, well, okay, if I exist within the society that I exist within, how is that actually determined, my questioning of all of this? Because this actually gets into kind of the idea of Judith Butler's idea of the troubling of gender, about how capitalism has actually brought about, I don't know if you necessarily call it progressive, but certainly historically progressive ideas of breaking that binary of sex and gender. And, this gets into the idea, which is a huge question of, has recent movements for trans rights, recent movements, feminist movements, gay rights movements going back, centuries. Like, have those happened because of capitalism? Have those happened in spite of capitalism? It's a really interesting idea. And the authors here seem to be saying actually because of capitalism, even though it's also a struggle against capitalism. Now I'm just kind of rambling, but these ideas are so thought provoking that it's kind of hard not to. You know what I mean? It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel overly informed or able, I suppose, to speak to that specifically. I do wonder, like, it does open a question, which I don't know whether I'm curious to know whether you feel like the authors of this piece lean toward one argument or the other, because I didn't feel like overly convinced that they were sort of like demonstrating some of the reasons why gender continues to exist, and sort of like a gender disparity in terms of like sort of like material life outcomes, I suppose, not just the sort of like the continued existence of a binary, but like that being sort of like potentially disadvantageous for one gender that was sort of defined by certain characteristics. I couldn't work out whether they were saying that continued to exist, like the continued existence of that was necessary in some ways for the continued existence of capitalism, or rather just capitalism was using it in specific ways, or in that term you were just in that in what you were saying about women or people who are able to bear children being like negatively disadvantaged, not consciously by capitalism, but purely by virtue of the fact that like a formal equality was leading to capitalism making certain choices about the value of their labor or the worthwhileness of their investing in it or their hiring it or whatever. So certainly there are negative outcomes, and there is a version of this argument that, as we've talked about, where like non-social social labor is a sort of valuable input to the ongoing continuation and functionality of capitalism, I suppose. But it did, at the same time, it didn't feel like it was making a knockdown argument that was entirely focused on why capitalism maintains misogyny and disadvantages some genders over others, kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I mean, I think we did the right thing in reading these Endnotes essays out of order, because in the essay that we read that Emmy O'Brien wrote about family abolishment, she seemed to be making the point that like the kind of ongoing precarity of labor and the ongoing like commodification of reproductive labor was leading to a questioning of gender and a questioning of sex that seemed to be because of capitalism. And the authors in this are making a point that I think is slightly different, which is about the like denaturalization of gender and sex in capitalism. But I'm not sure that I actually fully understand that kind of latter argument, because they're making an argument in this also about precarity of labor, because they're saying that like the feminization, quote unquote, of the workforce is actually probably more so, it's less to do with like capitalists being nice and capitalism all of a sudden not going by its laws, but more so based on the idea that like labor is just a lot more precarious now, and there are a lot less permanent contracts. So if you're someone that's like, a single mom, you can, this is really grim, but it's like you can raise your kids, and then when they're at school, you can go drive for Uber or Deliveroo or something like that. But then they also seem to be making a point that is kind of speaking to, I think, what you said about how necessary are these gendered binaries for capitalism. Obviously, they're making the point here. It seems that like capitalism itself is the thing that reproduces these specific gender binaries through an ongoing process of like labor shifting in and out of these different spheres. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Maybe that's the important way of looking at it, right? Like, clearly it is being reproduced. How is it being reproduced? The question isn't necessarily will it be reproduced forever inside of capitalism, but simply that here are the processes of its reproduction and how they intersect with how capitalism works, or like how they overlap with. So that's the fundamentals of how capitalism works, I suppose.
Well, that's a good point, because that gets to the last bit, which is their kind of like political analysis of political project, which is this idea of the abject right, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I can tell, this is the idea that a lot of this reproductive labor that was waged at one point, that was existing in the DMM sphere, the directly moderated, market moderated sphere, is now falling back into kind of the IMM sphere, but also they come up with a different word for it, which is this abject, which let me just really quickly see if I can find their definition of it. Yeah, it's basically, they say, so we will see that all of these possibilities are limited. There's always a remainder for which we will refer to as the abject. That is something that cannot be subsumed or is not worth subsuming. It's obviously not abject per se. It exists as abject because of capital and is shaped by it. There is always this remainder that has to remain outside of market relations, and the question of who has to perform it in the family will always be, to say the least, a conflictual matter. So this is them getting into this, much more like concrete analysis of our current situation, which is that, okay, what does this mean for our world now? All of these different ideas. What it means is that in the UK, the NHS is getting, scuttled. It means that all around the world, state-sponsored childcare facilities are being shut down. Public kindergartens are being shut down. So instead of this work shifting back into the IMM sphere, because of the state that capitalism is in currently, it's actually falling into something which they call the abject, which is a remainder of social labor that capitalism is just no longer able to organize at all, either because it physically can't or because it just doesn't want to, because states, are, riddled with austerity these days due to crises of profitability. And there's just no way that they can keep up the level of, the paltry amount of reproductive labor that the states were sponsoring as waged labor throughout the kind of 20th century. And this leads them to kind of disagree with Silvia Federici, which we kind of hinted at the beginning, where Silvia Federici is like in a very funny way. Huh?
I feel like it is worth, you're going to do it, but it is worth explaining what Federici is saying, because like,
yeah, go for it.
In my understanding, all it is that like, so the authors of this piece are describing sort of like mid 2010s austerity, the retreat of the state from certain spheres of, what should we call it, like social reproduction, I guess, and the necessity sort of fall of that care work falling back onto women by and large, like that sphere of non-wage, non-market mediated reproductive relations is growing again. It would seem Silvia Federici is kind of like celebrating that in some ways as an opportunity. She is presenting this circumstance as an opportunity for, okay, people that Federici believes should be women, which is maybe one of the problematic points, is to say that like this work should be done by women, and the opportunity presented to women in this situation is to not retreat back into doing this work entirely privately, but to create sort of new communal opportunities to meet these social needs in a sort of space outside of capitalism, I guess. Like she's imagining here is a sphere that could grow external to capitalism. Whereas what I understand the authors of this piece mean by the abject is to say, no, this shouldn't be something which is celebrated. It should be something that should be recognized as detrimental and bad. It will always exist, but it's a position from which outside of the system, whereby the system can be contested, I suppose. There is, I guess, it's not that the people in that position should be looking for ways into the wage relation, but it should be recognized that this is like exists in a binary or a dialectic, I suppose, where it's like, whereas it seems Federici is just proposing two separate positions, the authors of this piece are saying, no, here are two dialectically related positions that are non-waged and the waged. One can be contested from the other, I suppose.
Yeah,
I guess a hypothetical political project that could come out of that is what I was describing before, of like trying to make all labor social in some ways. I don't know.
Which kind of seems to be both of their conclusions.
Yeah, maybe it's
more or less.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's the reason why I wanted to be. Seems I'm not favorable to Federici's position, but like I understand what she's trying to say. I can see why it could. I mean, I can imagine a certain type of like person who sort of both. In some ways, it reads as quite a conservative position potentially, but radical at the same time. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because I think the distinction that the authors are trying to make is that Federici is like, look, this is labor, so it's an opportunity to organize labor. And maybe the authors of this are like, it's actually not labor. You know what I mean? Which I understand, and I fully appreciate what they're saying. And I think it's actually more of like a politically useful propaganda kind of tool to actually frame it as the abject, as opposed to like an opportunity to organize. You know what I mean? Because if you speak to anybody about this kind of work, they're going to be like, yeah, that work actually kind of sucks. I don't really enjoy that. But to kind of what you're saying, well, yeah, from what I'm kind of taking from what you're saying is also like the political projects, the concrete realities of those political projects might be kind of similar. You could maybe say that there's like some kind of old school socialist ideas in what Federici is saying, whereas obviously the kind of like organizing the abject kind of stuff is much more of like a communization style political project. But at the end of the day, it is like, I think you could phrase it as organizing this labor along non-hierarchical, non-gendered lines, and presumably they would all agree with that. And it's just more of a like recognition that, this work kind of fucking sucks, and like recognizing it as such and not trying to treat it with that kind of 20th century like, we can all be workers, we can all be housewives. It's like they're like, we want to abolish all of those.
Let's all be workers and housewives.
Yeah, and this speaks to the last little bit, which is they're like, this is when I was like, okay, this is why this is an Endnotes, is because they say the process of denaturalization creates the possibility of gender appearing as an external constraint. This is not to say that the constraint of gender is less powerful than before, but that it can now be seen as a constraint, that is, as something outside oneself that it is possible to abolish. You could just replace gender with worker, and it's like, that is basically the communization line, right? Where it's like, the goal isn't to make all of us workers, the goal is to self-abolish the worker. And it's like, man, there you go, dude. I mean, it's absolutely right. And I think that this kind of speaks to maybe the idea of a lot of this like really progressive questioning of what sex and gender actually is that we've gotten recently, is actually the result of the flux that capitalism finds itself in, which is a weird kind of uncomfortable thing to think about, but also a necessary one if you want to build any kind of like emancipatory project, right? Yeah. Yeah. It blows all of that stupid bullshit about like chauvinistic Marxism, right? Where it's like, not only just trying to organize workers, but like, all of these ideas of gender, it's so hedonistic. It's, it's so silly. It's just like, fuck off. It's like, do you want to emancipate people or not? It's like, oh my God. The last thing I'll say is this also made me think, like, they say something in here about, like, they say, it's not that this is when they're criticizing Federici. They say, it's not that we will have to, quote unquote, go back to the kitchen, if only because we cannot afford it. Our fate, rather, is having to deal with the abject. Contrary to the IMM activities of the past, the abject has already been, to a large extent, denaturalized. And this just made me think, like, an analysis of our, modern times. It's like, this is just where all of that stupid trad wife online bullshit comes from. The like totally reactionary, like, but wouldn't it be great if we could return to an era where you had domain over your castle as a man and a wife that made shitty food made out of jello every day? Wouldn't that be great? It's just like, that this is the material basis of that reactionary politics, right? Where it's like, they call it the abject, the fact that gender is being denaturalized, the fact that like, young conservative men are seeing like, their power over women completely destroyed in front of them. That's making them even more reactionary. It's interesting. It's very, very interesting. Mm-hmm. The online trad wave stuff, it's just like, wow, it's crazy. It's so crazy. What are you going to do? Mm-hmm. Oh, the gender question, Dan. Yeah. We answered it.
Yeah, no, I think we've opened a can of worms, or opened a new thing that would be quite good to explore further, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very good stuff. And again, I mean, we've said this. If this is like all of the stuff, you do have to at least make an effort with this stuff if you want to have some kind of socialist politics, because, you can't just focus on the factory workers, unfortunately. The shredded male factory workers, which is what we all wish we could just do.
We'd like to, yeah.
we have to self-abolish the shredded male factory worker in your mind. Uh-huh. So what are you going to do? All right. Well, who knows when the next episode will be? Maybe we'll record one more for over Christmas, but we'll say this now. We're also both going to be busy, so maybe it'll be a little while for an episode. What are you going to do? Too bad.
Yeah. Have a very nice winter solstice.
There you go. Just make it to the winter solstice, and then it's all uphill from there. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Jack.
Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much, 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 much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.